Jamie, if we were having this discussion, let's say starting in 2005, definitely in 2006, once Florida upset Ohio State in the national championship game in resounding fashion and the SEC went on its run, we would really not have much of a reasonable debate for 5 or 6 years after that. I would have been laughed off of here in regards to trying to debate that any other conference matched the SEC. Then over the last 3 or 4 years, obviously the SEC has maintained its competitive nature, but other conferences have jumped up. But maybe not as much as what the evidence shows this season, with the Big Ten playing well in the non-conference during the regular season, not so much during the bowl play, but winning games over LSU and Oklahoma and some other big matchups. The ACC really looking good during bowl play. Where do you think the SEC stands right now? What are your thoughts about the level of play in the conference?
Well, for the last 2 weeks, I think they haven't been the best conference in the country. And there was a great statement earlier about things that can go on in bowls. And credit to the ACC for a great bowl season. Credit to the Big Ten for a great regular season, as they were probably the preemptive conference in the country during the regular season. However, when you start talking about the best conference in the country, it's probably a little short-sighted to use a one-year window. I think the SEC still has probably as much or more talent than any other conference in the country. Give the conferences their due. Great job, great showing from the other conferences throughout the year and in the bowl season. But at the end of the day, you're still going to have to look up at Alabama. They are, the preemptive program in the country, no matter what anybody else wants to think. And as long as the big dog is in what is perceived to be one of, if not the best conference in the country, I think their standing is fine. They had some poor performances. Auburn threw up a stinker for sure and things of that nature. But at the same time, you had to think Auburn had a chance, but you also had a 4-loss team playing in the Sugar Bowl. There were a reason they were a 4-loss team, and that popped up.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point. It's a nice segue here because Alabama is so much better than everyone else in the SEC. Even when Alabama, between roughly 2009 and up until last year, was generally the best team in the SEC most of those years, there were 2 or 3 other teams that were on their heels. LSU, Auburn, whoever it was at the time. There were other top 5, top 10 teams, and the SEC just littered the top 10. What's happened is, I don't know necessarily that the SEC top to bottom is any worse than it's been, but you had teams just beating up on each other. So perception plays so much into this because there's so few games to rely on for evidence that people look at rankings. And when you get a bunch of 8-4 teams, regardless of how good they are, they're not going to get highly ranked because they lost 4 games, but you got a ton of them in the SEC this year. They just happen to beat up on each other.
I think the middle of the conference was really tough this year for the SEC. They didn't have a second team to go with Alabama, and that's a fair statement for anyone to make. Most of the other conferences had a second team that were better than any representative that the SEC could throw out there, and that's a very fair assessment. Do the other conferences go as far as the 8th team as the SEC? Probably not. So it just depends on which part of the conversation you want to look at. I think where the SEC lags behind the other conferences, and it has been this way for quite some time for me, is in quarterback play. And that's not to say that the quarterbacks in the SEC are not quality football players. That's not to say that they're not really good college football players. But quarterback play is a lot of the time judged based off of your NFL potential. And over the years in the SEC, you have not seen as many NFL-type quarterbacks come through the SEC. And when you have, those teams have typically been very good. Even, A.J. McCarron, yes, he was playing with Alabama, but he was one of the very few prototypical NFL-type quarterbacks, and he's a backup. You have to go way back before you find one that was great, other than, say, Cam Newton, who did win an MVP, had a rough year this year, but there's just not a lot of great quarterback play historically coming out of the SEC when you match it up to other positions, and I think that's where they lag behind.
And to be fair about Auburn's performance in the Sugar Bowl, yeah, they were pretty well shellacked in the second half, but Auburn was basically selected as the second seed from the SEC. they had the same record as Tennessee, LSU, Texas A&M, Florida. Any one of those teams could have been selected to go to the Sugar Bowl and play what was undoubtedly, with no question, the undefeated team from the Big 12. So they're playing the best team by far in the Big 12 as maybe the second best team, maybe the fifth best team in the SEC. We don't know because those teams are all so close as the way things turned out this year.